You can't win your league without good running backs. So today I'm breaking down my redraft running back rankings with a couple of big surprises on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check out my Dynasty and Rookie rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can follow us on Instagram, where I release my rankings first at the Fantasy First Down, and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. I also write some articles over at football.razzball.com. Today we're talking redraft rankings, and we're specifically talking running backs, and got a couple of surprises in store for you. There's a couple of guys that I think people are a little bit low on that I think you should be taking earlier. Plus, we're also talking handcuffs and the best guys to take in the later rounds. So let's get into it. I'll be doing what I did in my QB rankings earlier. If you haven't already, make sure you go and check those out. So I'm starting things off with the obvious number one. I was high on him last year, and I'm high on him again this year. It's Christian McCaffrey. He's really by far the best receiving running back, while also being an excellent downhill runner. We know that with the San Francisco 49ers, they're going to score a lot of points, and CMC is going to be heavily involved. Realistically, CMC may not be the number one running back at the end of the year, but trying to guess who will be instead of him is a whole lot harder than just assuming it's probably going to be the guy who was the best player in football last year, despite the fact he's not a quarterback, and was arguably the best player in fantasy as well. So for me, I'm going to take CMC way over everyone else in pretty much every league setting, as long as it's redraft and as long as it's no superflex. This is a little bit of a hot take, but my number two is Bijan Robinson. I feel like there's a little bit more upside in this offense. I think it's going to be a little bit more high scoring, a little bit more high powered. I feel like he's going to get slightly more checkdowns based on the way that they play. And I'm also a little bit scared about Braylon Allen taking away some goal line touches from Breece Hall. So I know that Breece Hall looked fantastic last year. I'm sure he'll be great again this year. I just think that Bijan has slightly more upside based on everything that's happening in that offense. If he gets the number of touches we're expecting him to get, then he could be an absolute PPR monster and threatens Christian McCaffrey. I don't know that Breece Hall really has that in his locker, though I also think he'll be very, very, very good. Breece Hall is obviously my number three. He was great last year, even though he was coming off an ACL, and he should step up this year. I expect that if he stays healthy, he should be a top three running back. I just don't know that he can get past Bijan if everything goes right. I don't know that he has quite that same upside, but if you want to take Hall over Robinson, I would not argue at all. They're very close to me. I've really had them back and forth for quite some time, and I think it's entirely reasonable to take Hall as high as number two as well. I should mention, though, that I do have a fairly big gap between Christian McCaffrey and these two guys. I think in a draft, you're probably sliding in some wide receivers, and in super flex, there's a heap of quarterbacks going into that gap as well. So keep in mind that even though they're 1, 2, and 3, there's a 1, and then there's a 2 and a 3. Now, where things get interesting is number 4. And I've got Jonathan Taylor, though a lot of people have different players coming in here. He has been injured the last couple of years, and that's really affected his output. I do think that he's got that capacity to go back to being a top running back. We saw how good the Colts running game was last year, and Taylor just wasn't healthy. If he can stay healthy this year, and he's done it several times, he's had several fully healthy seasons, and I don't think his injuries are ones that should definitely keep him out or are likely to necessarily recur. And if he's able to stay healthy, I do think that he could easily go past even Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson if everything goes right for him. We know how good he can be. We just need to see him stay on the field. I'm willing to take that chance, although I certainly can see an argument for wanting to go elsewhere based on the fact that you can definitely lose your league in the first couple of rounds. But even with Taylor, you can't win it. Saquon Barkley slides in at number 5 to me. Don't feel great about this. There's certainly a bit of a drop-off between the top 3 and Taylor, and then a little bit more of a drop-off to Barkley. I do love the talent. He's so good. He's been so productive in New York, despite the fact that that team's been awful. He's very injury-prone, but it's hard to tell if that's just because the O-line was making it really hard for him, if that's just him naturally, if it was just bad luck because he's a running back. There's a lot of different possibilities there, and I do think it's possible that he'll go to Philly and they'll use him smarter. We don't really want him used smarter, though. We kind of want him used harder. We want him getting a lot of touches in a high-powered offense. I'm worried about Hurts stealing the goal line touches. I'm worried about the possibility that he might get hurt. I'm worried about the possibility that they use not only Kenny Gainwell, but also bring in Will Shipley, because they did say before the draft They definitely wanted to bring in a complementary running back. And we don't know whether that means a guy who's just going to help him out and take a couple of touches off him, or if they mean like a true thunder and lightning situation, or in this case, kind of lightning and lightning. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but where they took Shipley and the kind of player he is, I do think he sits behind Barkley and would only really be of interest if Barkley goes down. So Barkley slides in at number 5, but he is pretty close to my number 6, Jahmyr Gibbs, who you could easily take as high as number 4. There's definitely upside there. We saw he was very good. I just don't think David Montgomery is going away. The fact that Montgomery could get injured does mean that if that happened, Gibbs is all of a sudden going to be a potential league winner. But you're kind of requiring an injury for that to really happen. So for that reason, Gibbs sits behind these two guys, but I can see an argument for taking him out earlier. 4, 5, and 6 for me are especially 5 and 6 are very much in that same tier. And I think especially in PPR, this is more of a half PPR ranking, but in PPR, Gibbs certainly slides ahead of Barkley and arguably gets very close to Taylor, if not going past him, depending on the circumstance. I do hope that the Lions use Gibbs a little bit more effectively last season, but you don't want them ruining their efficiency. We saw that with Tony Pollard last year. We thought, well, Pollard's going to get a heap more carries. He's going to be fantastic. And he wasn't. He was just worse on the carries that he got. He hardly got more yards or more touchdowns, despite the fact he was getting a heap more touches because he was getting run down on those heavy downs, and they're not able to be as efficient on his other touches. And it's possible that happens with Gibbs if they start to give him more touches. I do think they probably want to keep using Montgomery to some extent. Kyren Williams is number 7. And I know there's the threat of Blake Corum there, but I do think they still really like Kyren Williams. Williams was fantastic last year, but we saw him get injured and we saw how much that hurt them. I do think that potentially they just want to make sure they have a very good, clear backup situation in place in case Williams goes down. But I still think they love Williams. I don't think he's going to get 100% touches at times like he did last year. I do think that we're talking about more of a 70% touchback, and that's why he falls away a little bit. But the goal line upside is massive. I do think that if he can stay clearly ahead of Blake Corum, he's going to be very good, but there is more risk with this pick than the other guys, which is why he drops down a little bit for me. Travis Etienne, quietly, the running back 2 last year, and not a lot of people are talking about that, and this is quite a high ranking for him compared to a lot of people, despite the fact that this is way lower than he finished last year. I know they're talking about trying to bring Tank Bigsby more in. They said that last year, and he got like 1 touch a game. I don't know that that's going to happen again. There's certainly been no signs from the beat reporters to suggest that he's suddenly been blowing up OTAs. In fact, there have been concerns that he hasn't been doing that when he was last year. And last year wasn't even enough to get him on the field. So I think it's probably Dearness Johnson who's the number 2, and he's really just spelling ETN. I know that they keep saying that they want to use him a little bit more sparingly, and yet we saw that didn't happen last year. I can imagine a situation where he goes back and does exactly the same thing. So I like the upside for that reason, and for that reason, I'm willing to take him in this range. And I can see an argument for taking him in front of Kyren Williams as well. He certainly got less threat to his job. Number 9, I do not feel comfortable about at all. Remember, these are basically half PPR rankings. For that reason, Henry goes a little bit higher than he would otherwise. Look, he didn't look washed last year, but he certainly didn't look like the Derrick Henry of old. He's still a very good running back. He's still one of the best pure rushers in the league, but he got a lot of receiving down work, and that kind of helped prop up his numbers. I'm not sure that that's going to happen with Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. Having said that, we do know that it is a far more effective running game in Baltimore. They've been very good with guys like Gus Edwards, and Derrick Henry is even at this age, a big step up from Gus Edwards, who's a solid running back, but Derrick Henry is a lot better. For that reason, I'm willing to take him for that upside and the fact that he is the clear number 1 guy. I don't think there's a clear backup there. I think we'll see a little bit of Justice Hill on the on like 3rd and longs and things like that. I think we'll see Keaton Mitchell just to kind of mix it up and give you that true thunder and lightning situation. But I do still think that Henry's the clear number 1 and he's going to get the vast majority of touches, and that's why I'm willing to have him in my top 10. Rachaad White is a tough one. I've had him higher, I've had him lower. I've been a bit all over the place. They brought in Bucky Irving, and that kind of freaks me out a little bit. But Bucky Irving's a pretty small back. I know he can technically play on every down, but he's really more of a receiving back. And that felt like a really weird pick to me because Rachaad White's a good receiving back. In college, he was not an every down back, and he was a good receiving back in college. I don't really understand why they've brought in a back who's kind of got a similar profile, but worse, and is kind of good at the things that White's good at and not offering anything else. I just have to assume that that's more of a backup situation, which is not how I originally viewed it. And for that reason, White stays quite high for me. We saw how they used him. They really funneled this offense through Rashad White, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and a little bit of Kate Otten. And that was it. That was the offense. And I expect they'll do the same thing again because while they brought in Jalen McMillan, realistically, he is going to get some touches around the line of scrimmage. But I do think that Rashad White's still going to be the main check down guy. And McMillan's not even going to be out there on a lot of the plays. So I think that White's not going to be affected too much like that. Plus, Evans and Godwin are aging, and that means that we might see White get even more heavily involved. It's just going to depend on whether they can stay close in games so that they don't need to start chasing games late on. Even then, you're still going to get some checkdowns to White, so it's still going to be okay. Josh Jacobs is someone I really wanted in my top 10, and I nearly slid him in there, but I just have to put White ahead of him. I do feel like there's a little bit more upside there. Jacobs is still under threat from Marshall and Lloyd. I think that Jacobs is probably the clear every down back, but I do think it's a possibility they go with another committee like they did with Jones and Dillon in the past. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen. I just think that risk is enough for me to bring Jacobs down slightly. He was absolutely spectacular in 2022, struggled a lot more in 23, obviously missed those last 4 games, but still looked solid. And I think if he'd played all 17 games, he at least would have been over 1,000 yards. But the Raiders were just in general poor last year. I did expect that he'd do a little bit better behind an O-line that made Zamir White look very good, but I still think in Green Bay, most backs look spectacular, and Jacobs is not old. This is going into his age 26 season. So we're talking about a guy that's still got a number of good years ahead of him. He's not washed by any means. It's not like he's had a lot of injuries. And for that reason, I do like Jacobs a lot, and I think he'll be good. It's just going to be a case of how many touches they give Lloyd, and potentially maybe AJ Dillon gets a bit involved, though we've all got to hope not, because gosh, he's been terrible. Isaiah Pacheco slides in right after them, and he's someone that's being overlooked by a lot of people. I really like his upside this season. I looked into his stats recently, and this is one I put on Twitter. In the games where Jerick McKinnon played, Isaiah Pacheco always had between 40 and 70% snaps. And a lot of those early in the season were in that 40 to 50 range. They rose a little bit, but he never got to 70% snaps while McKinnon was playing. In the weeks that McKinnon was out, he was always over 70% snaps, 70 to 80, even more. And when Clyde Edwards-Helaire was out as well, he played 93% snaps. So we're talking about a guy with Jerick McKinnon still out at the Chiefs and no talk of bringing him back. Isaiah Pacheco might get both roles. And if he can get those goal line roles, they're going to be very valuable because they use McKinnon on the goal line as a receiving back so that Mahomes is throwing the ball as much as possible in those good situations. If they use Pacheco there, all of a sudden his value is going to skyrocket because he's going to be getting a lot more touchdowns and also a lot more receptions. So there's upside here. And even if he doesn't get that, as long as they don't bring McKinnon back, all of a sudden he becomes that 70% plus touch back. They've really only got Clyde Edwards-Helaire behind him and a whole lot of nobodies. So for that reason, I really like Pacheco's upside, and I think he might potentially even rise. It's just there's no one clearly to bring down relative to him, but I like him a lot, and I'll be getting him in a lot of drafts, I expect. James Cook, I struggled with a little bit. He was a top 12 back last season, but he wasn't playing as many snaps as you like. He was losing a lot of snaps to Latavius Murray, and he loses a lot of goal line touchdowns to Josh Allen. But the Bills were so good that he was still very efficient and very effective. I don't know that he can do that again. I'm very scared by Ray Davis. Ray Davis is a big back, and he's going to be used on the goal line. He's going to replace that Latavius Murray role. He's also a good receiving back. So it might be that Ray Davis takes a lot of the valuable touches, and all of a sudden James Conner's getting used between the 20s. That's useful for the team. But that's not great for fantasy. You're not getting a lot of big scores between the 20s. You're going to need to break off some big runs to give you fantasy points each week. And for that reason, I'm not really willing to risk it. He's lower for me for that reason. And I think you can probably do better. Alvin Kamara is an interesting one. There have been talks that he's sitting out for a new contract, despite the fact he's making nearly $20 million this year. Admittedly, a lot of them aren't guaranteed. A lot of that money is not guaranteed, and he's been injured a lot in the last few seasons. We're talking about a guy who was a number 1 running back just 4 seasons ago. So he's not a long gone, but running backs can fall off really quickly, and I think it is really possible that he's hitting that age range where that will happen. He does have the benefit of the fact that he's used as a receiving back a lot more, and that can kind of be sustained a lot more through time, and it is possible that because of that, he will hang around for a little bit longer, but I think he's headed for that sort of situation where he's no longer the clear number 1, and that makes him scary. Having said that, if he can keep that clear number 1 role, and we can't say that Jamal Williams or Kendre Miller were exactly threatening him for that role, I'd be willing to think that Kamara could definitely be another top 10 back this year. He was a top 10 back only playing 13 games last year, so there's no reason why he couldn't do it this year. It would just require a lot of checkdowns. but that's very much in Derek Carr's window of possibilities. So I think there's certainly upside there, but there's significantly more risk. This is more of a boom bust pick than most would like to accept. Joe Mixon slides in at number 15 after sliding across to the Texans. This is a good offense to be going to. You want to be going to a high scoring offense, and with CJ Stroud and Stephon Diggs coming in, they've still got Nico Collins. They've got Tank Dell. They've got some solid tight ends without being spectacular, and they've got Joe Mixon. Dalton Schultz obviously be the number one of them, but they've got some other guys they'll use as well. That's a good package of plays. I think their offense is going to be solid, and their defense is building, led by a couple of young guys as well. So I think this could be a very good team this year, and I feel like you want plays in high-scoring offenses, and that's why I'm willing to take a chance on Mixon. I feel like he is the clear number one. There's not really anyone threatening him. Dameon Pierce was very disappointed when given the starting role back in 2022, despite the fact he had like the third most touches and the 13th most points or something crazy like that in 2022. So it's no surprise they gave Devin Singletary that role, but he's too small and he's out of town now anyway. Mixon should do a significantly better job. He is aging out a little bit, but I still think he's got a couple of good seasons in him, and you only need him for 1 year because this is redraft rankings. Ramondre Stevenson just got a big contract. For that reason, I've got a little bit more confidence in him to have a clear lead role. I know they brought in Antonio Gibson, but I feel like that's more of a backup situation and a third and long situation rather than being a true committee back. At least that's what I'm hoping. I don't think it makes sense to pay that much money to Stevenson and use him as a committee back, especially not immediately when that new contract extension hasn't even kicked in yet. That seems really weird. So I do think that's probably a lot of Stevenson. He has struggled to stay healthy, and I think that was another good reason to bring in Gibson. But I don't know. Do you really want to believe that a guy who struggled to get touches in Washington is suddenly going to take him away from a guy who's just given like double-digit millions of dollars each year? I think you've got to believe it's going to be a lot of Stevenson. This offense is going to be poor, but their run game has been the one thing that's managed to stand up. He was a top 10 back in 2022. Wasn't as good last year, but wasn't as healthy last year. So if he can get back healthy, I do think he can be solid, but the lack of high point scoring by this offense is the reason I've got him a little bit lower. De'Von Achane is way lower than everyone else has him. He's going top 10 everywhere. I get that in Dynasty because you can see a situation where Raheem Mostert will go and then Achane will be that valuable back who's getting goal line carries. I don't know he really profiles as that. He was very much a receiving back in college and a speed back. I don't know that there's an easy situation to see. And they brought in Jalen Wright, who's more of a natural replacement for Raheem Mostert. So I'm not sure that I can really trust that to be the case. I think Achane probably is the more valuable fantasy asset this year, but his finishes last year really got buoyed by some fantastic big runs and some massive games where he's scoring 4 touchdowns in the second half of games where they were just blowing out teams like the Broncos. I don't know that's necessarily going to happen again. I think teams know that that's happening and they're going to find ways to shut that down. So Achane's massively risky for me. I would not take him at his current cost. I'll have him in 0 leagues except for the ones that I drafted him last year in Dynasty. It's just way too expensive and there's not that upside. He's not a clear number one back. They're never going to have a clear number one back. They'll always use a committee, at least 2, if not 3 backs. And realistically, even if Mostert gets injured, Wright goes into that role, and then Jeff Wilson gets involved, or Salvon Ahmed gets involved, or Chris Brooks gets involved. They're going to find other guys. They want to use 3 backs, 2 main backs and a supplementary back, and they will do it no matter who is healthy. For that reason, you can't trust Achane to get a really healthy amount of touches. He's fantastic in best ball, but in redraft, I just can't trust him. I think he's going to lose a lot of people their leagues by wasting a pick. Aaron Jones is someone I like a lot. He's struggled to stay healthy a bit over the last couple of years, but gosh, he's been impressive when he's been healthy. So efficient, so effective, such a good receiving back. I feel like he's exactly what they need in Minnesota. I'd have him way higher, but I do think we're going to see a lot of Ty Chandler as well. I think this is a committee situation where both of them are very good, as we've seen Aaron Jones thrive in Green Bay. But it's now in Minnesota with a worse quarterback situation, and I feel like the team might struggle to score points a little bit. We have seen their running backs be very effective. Dalvin Cook's been very good in fantasy for a long time. Nothing much has changed since then, but I do think that we're going to see something a little bit different. How that looks for Aaron Jones, I think it's probably going to be good, but I think the upside is capped by the fact that I think Ty Chandler will definitely be involved. Kenneth Walker's been number 19 the last 2 seasons, so guess where I ranked him? Yeah, I'm real creative. He's 19th. My biggest concern with Walker is not the amount of touches he's getting. It's the number of snaps he's getting. He's getting outsnapped in most games by Zach Charbonnet. He's just not getting the touches, Charbonnet. when he's on the field. Charbonnet is on there in passing downs and Walker's out there on rushing downs. And that's okay, but teams are going to work that out eventually. And you can't keep doing that. Plus, they've obviously got some changes to their to their play callers. So I'm not really sure that you can trust exactly what's going to happen there. It could turn into a full-blown committee, and that would be terrible. It could be that Walker's the true number one back, though I don't think so. I think we're still going to see a lot of Charbonnet, if not having him take over entirely, and that makes him really risky here. I'm not even fully comfortable on him in this spot. DeAndre Smith, sorry, that's not even a name. DeAndre Swift comes in at 20. He's really struggled to stay healthy, but he's still been very good. The problem is that I feel like the Bears probably know that that's likely to continue. They've still got Khalil Herbert. They've still got Roshan Johnson. And I feel like they've got them there as backups in case Swift goes down. And they're going to keep doing what they did until Swift gets healthy again. They'll still get touches in most games, though neither is going to be the clear backup. If one's going to be, it'll be Johnson. But I don't think there's going to be a clear backup. Swift is definitely the guy to own in this backfield. This could be an excellent offense depending on how Caleb Williams goes. If Williams slides in very nicely, then you can imagine this being a high-powered offense immediately with Keenan Allen, with Rome Odunze, and of course with DJ Moore, plus Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett. There's a lot of good offensive players there. You do have to worry about the touches getting distributed, but the running back usually gets enough touches to make it work. I feel like he's the guy that probably should pay off to some extent, and you're getting a bit of a bargain here, but that injury risk is big. The risk of the other committee backs getting involved more than you want is also big. So it's hard to feel good about Swift, but I feel pretty solid about him. Anyone who's been following me over the years off YouTube knows that I love James Conner. This guy is elite as a running back. He's constantly injured, but he's elite. He's a really good pure running back and a surprisingly solid receiving back as well. I don't think that Trey Benson is coming in here to create a committee. I think this is still James Conner's backfield, and we're still going to see him getting the bulk of the touches. I think Benson is the backup, and that when Conner eventually leaves at the end of this year, which I think he probably will, not necessarily to retire, but I think that the Cardinals see him kind of aging out at that point in time. I think that Trey Benson comes in then. I think it's a weird way of doing things, but I think the Cardinals just had so many picks this year and Benson was available. It kind of made sense to do it that way. They were kind of wasting picks. You see the Tip Ryman pick, for example. I think that's probably what's going to happen with Benson. I think Connor's going to be the main guy here. Probably see a little bit of Michael Carter as a receiving back. We saw there was that report I had on one of my videos recently where they talked about Carter being the receiving back and Benson not being involved at all. I don't agree with that. I think Benson will be involved. But it's going to be very much a committee, not dissimilar to the way New York was doing it, where you saw a little bit of Dalvin Cook. I think that will be Trey Benson, and that grows over the course of the year, and a little bit of receiving back as well. But James Conner is definitely going to be the main guy. And when he's the main guy, he's surprisingly effective. I think he's going to be a real bargain. But the problem with using James Conner, and the reason I wouldn't take him higher than this, is his role is going to fade over the season. You don't want your starting running back to be less useful in the fantasy playoffs than he was earlier in the season. There's a good chance that by the fantasy playoffs, Conner will either be injured or in some sort of ugly committee with Benson. And that's what scares me, especially if the Cardinals fall out of playoff contention. All of a sudden, there's no reason for them to use Conner. They're better off moving on to the new guy. So that's what scares me about Conner. But gosh, early in the season, he's going to be real good. And I would want to hold on to him for those first few weeks and then potentially trade him away to someone who thinks they're getting a win-now piece when they're actually not. David Montgomery is going to be interesting this year. I do expect that he'll probably sit in that late running back two range. And that's probably where he belongs. I feel like he's going to be in a committee with Jahmyr Gibbs, but we know that Gibbs is going to start getting more valuable touches. You just got to hope as a Montgomery owner, you're going to get touchdowns because you guys get a surprising amount of rushing work, especially around the goal line. But we saw them start to give that to Gibbs a lot more over the course of the year, and that caused Montgomery to fall away a little bit. He's still a very good running back, though. We're talking about a guy who was the RB6 like 4 years ago or something like that. And he's remained solid since then. And he's staying, I should say, in a very good offense. So there's upside here. And the upside is mainly if Gibbs gets injured. If Gibbs gets injured, they're not going to bring in Craig Reynolds and suddenly use him as a committee back. It's going to be all Montgomery. This is only a committee because they've got two good backs and they want to use it that way in that situation. But they're not going to bring in another guy and use them as a true committee back. They know that David Montgomery can carry the load. So if Gibbs gets injured, you might have a league winner in Montgomery, and that's the main reason you're willing to take him. Zamir White is the total opposite of that. He's got a role, and it's a very clear role, and it doesn't matter what happens around him. That's going to be his role. Zamir White is the early down back, the goal line back. He's pure rushing back. He had all of 15 receptions last year, or 15% of his touches, I think, last year. In fact, in his career, have been receptions. So look, he's not a receiving back. We haven't seen that out of him. I hope that one day he might develop that, but realistically, they have a receiving back. They just drafted one. It's Dylan Lauby. They got him in the 6th round. He's an excellent receiver, but they also have Amir Abdullah, who was doing that role at times last year. I expect that to continue. So look at Zamir White's the last 4 games of last year and look at how they use White. It was very effective and was very good for non-PPR and solid for half PPR. If you're in a PPR league, though, you really have to drop White down because he's not going to get those receiving numbers, and that means he's very touchdown dependent, and that's not ideal. Raheem Mostert kind of is in a weird sort of similar category where he's got a very specific role, and that role is to score touchdowns and be really efficient on limited touches. I said the same thing about Achane, but Achane at least had the possibility to grow into a role. Mostert's not getting younger. They've just bought right in, so there's a real risk that Mostert loses that role. He was the running back 3 overall last year, which was fantastic, but that was so touchdown dependent. And early on in the season, he was getting a lot of touches, and when Achane was out, he was getting a lot of touches. That's not going to happen this year. They want it to be a committee. They don't want to lean on Mostert that much because they know he can get injured. They know the other guys can get injured. They want a committee, and for that reason, you probably want a part of that if you just want something safe, but the upside here is very limited. You're going to have some very, very, very good games, and you're also going to have him have a big risk of fading at times during the season. Brian Robinson's an interesting one for me. He was very quietly a top 24 running back last year. I didn't really notice that, but it is interesting how many touches he was getting and how much they were using him, especially because I believe the Commanders were the most pass-heavy team by percentage last year. So it's surprising that their running back, who wasn't even their receiving back, was so effective last year. I do think that this year he's going to be healthier. He's going to be fully recovered, and he is likely to be getting a lot of touches. Austin Ekeler isn't the best player to bring in, but Ekeler is very much a receiving back at this time of his career. I do think Robinson continues to take that early down work and that goal line work, and I think the Commanders could be sneaky good. I also like the fact that they've got Jaden Daniels, who's a very good rushing quarterback, and that's going to open a lot of holes for Robinson as well. So I like the upside here. It's just the lack of checkdowns that's an issue, but that's more likely to affect Ekeler than it is to affect Robinson. So I'm willing to take a shot on the upside of Robinson in that kind of running back dead zone where you know you're kind of paying a little bit too much, but you still want to get somebody who at least had a clearly defined role. I'm pretty low on Jonathan Brooks this year. I'm certainly a lot lower than a lot of people are. Here's why. He's injured. He's very, very injured. He will recover at some point in time, but right now he's very injured. We don't know when he's going to be back. We don't even definitively know he'll be back for week 1. He probably will be, but we don't know that for sure. Why would you draft a guy going into an average offense where you don't know exactly what his role is, coming off a serious injury? Like, I get it in Dynasty. That makes sense. But why are you doing it in redraft? The only thing you're hoping realistically is you can just hold him on your team until he finally becomes good, which probably won't happen until late in the season. So I'm very scared about Brooks. I'm worried about what his role is going to look like. I'm worried about how healthy he's going to be and therefore how explosive he is. I suspect he might not be good for fantasy until next year even. And that's just too much of a risk for me. So I'm taking him a lot lower. Plus the Panthers, they're not good. Like, they might be okay, but they're not good. Their running game has been solid at times, but realistically, I just think this is going to be a total mess. I just don't want any part of it. Devin Singletary comes in at number 27. He's probably the last pure every down running back. I do think that we could see Tyrone Tracy get involved. He's a good receiving back. He's a very old rookie, but I do think he could have a role. It's also possible Eric Gray gets involved somewhere, but Singletary's the main guy, and we know he is. He's not a very big back, actually. He's actually one of the shortest backs in the league. It was, I think, at one stage the 3rd shortest of the top 100 fantasy running backs, but he still gets used around the goal line. And we've seen play be effective around the goal line, despite being small, because not having a lot of size does mean you can sneak into some holes and things like that. He's never going to be a power back, but certainly he offers something. I just think this Giants offense is going to be terrible all round. And for that reason, I'm not really willing to take a chance on Singletary. It doesn't really make sense to me. So I'm going to go elsewhere. But if you're going 0 RB, and I have done this a couple of times, he's a guy you can get very, very late relative to his value. And for that reason, you might be willing to take him just until some of your more upside guys come around and you fill your roster and really make your roster strong at other positions and then take guys like Singletary. Zach Moss is another falls into that category, but I think he has a bit more upside. To me, he is the clear number one back, and we've seen the clear number one back in Cincinnati be very valuable. The number one back in Cincinnati has traditionally been Joe Mixon, and he's been a top 10 back a lot of the time. Is Zach Moss going to be that guy? I don't think so. I think Chase Brown is probably going to have more of a role. I think we're going to see Moss be the big back and Brown be the kind of the shifty back who gets a lot of the receiving work. We have seen Moss, who wasn't traditionally a receiving back, start to take on that role more in the last couple of seasons. And I'm hoping that continues this year. But I don't feel very good about the Moss situation. I see him as someone who's going to be sneakily better than you expect. And I think he's clearly got the role over Brown, but there's enough risk there that I'm not willing to take him until I've filled out the rest of my roster and I'm kind of going into a zero RB situation. He's certainly not someone I'd want to be using as a backup. I just don't think there's enough upside there to make that worthwhile. Najee Harris fits into that same category. It was messy last year. I knew it was going to be messy last year. I talked about Jalen Warren so much in the preseason. It was clearly going to be a committee. It's going to be the same again. The upside we didn't see last season is what happens if one of these guys gets injured, because they both managed to get through the whole season, which is kind of really surprising when you've got two running backs getting very heavily involved. I do think if that happens, that Najee Harris takes over that heavy early down role. I know they're talking about Cordarrelle Patterson having a proper role. I think he's just the backup. And I think if one of them gets injured, then Patterson comes in and takes maybe 20-30% of the snaps, which will make the other guy really valuable. So if Warren goes down, Harris becomes significantly more valuable. If Harris goes down, Warren becomes significantly more valuable, but less than Harris would because Warren's not as big a back and isn't able to take that same load. So that's why I've got Harris earlier, but ultimately I think this is going to be another really messy committee situation. I don't really want any part of it, but if you're getting him late enough, the upside of one of them getting injured and the other one becoming valuable is high enough that I'm willing to take that risk. At number 30, Tony Pollard. What a fall from last year. Look, this shouldn't have been a massive shock. I talked about this a bit in the off season that Pollard was always going to have some regression because his efficiency was always going to drop. I didn't see this happening. I must admit, I thought he'd still stay around that back end of the top 10 situation. He fell off even more. And now he goes into a situation where he's a committee back with Tyjae Spears in an offense that's going to struggle with a quarterback who's questionable at best. We know they don't have the O-line they used to have, although it has improved. They have brought in some good pieces. Look, I don't feel good about this at all. I don't feel good about taking Tony Pollard. I don't really know what to do with this situation, but I'm probably going to avoid it in most situations. I still have to rank him above guys who are truly handcuffs because he's going to have a role. He's still going to get you points each week. They're just not going to be league-winning points. They're just going to be enough points to get you by. So if you need to use him in a bye week, fine. But I'd rather have someone with more upside on my bench. So if I've got 3 running backs already, there's no situation where I'm considering taking Pollard. The upside just isn't there. Even if Spears gets injured, I was talking about how Warren and Harris have value if the other gets injured. If Spears gets injured, does Pollard have that much value? I don't know that he does. We didn't see him look particularly effective at Dallas, who has a far better running game. So I don't think he would in Tennessee either. Jalen Warren, there's the other guy I was talking about, of course. I already talked about this with Najee Harris. It's the same situation. Warren did score more points last year. He was explosive at times, but I don't think he has the same upside is in the same ability to be a top 10 back if the other guy gets injured. I think he's still going to be effective. And these previous finishes of PPR, which I know doesn't really make a lot of sense when these are half PPR rankings, but I made it for Dynasty and I didn't want to redo all of those. So I'm sorry, that's a PPR finish. He was lower in half PPR and that's why he's lower here. I think in a PPR league, he goes a little bit higher than this, but not by a lot because again, the upside is capped with all these guys in this range. Oh, look, it's the other Tennessee back. It's Tyjae Spears. I'm putting all these guys together. I don't know what to do with them. I don't want any of them, but you have to take them above guys who are clearly backups. So that's why he goes here. Look, he's got potential, despite the fact he's only got one ACL or no ACLs or something like that. He's certainly got potential. We saw he was solid last year. I think we all hoped that they'd just get in someone average and he could be the clear lead back. That's not how it turned out, and for that reason, I'm out on Spears. Austin Eckler is an interesting one because he looked awful last year, despite the fact he should have been the clear number one back. They've got nothing behind him. Joshua Kelly, they were giving chances. Isaiah Spiller, they were giving chances. They're giving chances to guys who have no rights to be getting chances ahead of Austin Eckler, and yet they were. Because Austin Eckler isn't Austin Eckler anymore. He's just past it. Now, I know he's only 28 years old. It's ridiculous to say someone can be past it when they're 28 years old. But in running back parlance, that's getting pretty old. I know that's Christian McCaffrey's age, but it's certainly getting to the point where you can't really trust that person to be consistently good anymore. So for that reason, I'm not willing to take Austin Eckler that much earlier than this. I think there is a little bit of upside if Robinson goes down. I think it's possible that he becomes the every down back, but I also think it's possible you see a lot of Chris Rodriguez, and that upside being capped means I'm not willing to take him too much higher. In PPR, he might jump someone like a Spears potentially, but probably not. I think this is probably the right range for him. I do think he'll get used a little bit, but Daniels isn't going to check down a lot because of his legs, and that is what worries me a bit about Eckler. Nick Chubb goes low because I just find it really hard to believe he's going to be healthy next year. And even if he is, are they going to be willing to give him the workload they used to give him? And even if they do, is he going to be able to make the most of it? And even if he is able to make the most of it, how long is he going to stay healthy for? There's a lot of question marks there. And that concerns me about Nick Chubb, who I love watching. He's one of my favorite pure runners. Got him in a lot of dynasty leagues, and that's really disappointing. So I'm not willing to take him higher than this. He's reaching that age where he's kind of risking aging out. I would rather just not take the risk. But by the time you get to this range, I mean, there's clearly some upside there that he could be the Browns' every down back if they do still see him that way. And so I'm willing to take him here in the hope that that happens. But I do think we probably see a lot of Jerome Ford, maybe even all Jerome Ford if Chubb doesn't get healthy. Gus Edwards is the clear number one back in LA. I know people have been talking about Kamani Vidal. Stop getting excited about very late round running backs. That pans out so rarely. It's going to be Gus Edwards. Look at the money. J.K. Dobbins is on a prove-it deal. There's no evidence to suggest he's healthy. He's done an ACL and an Achilles or something along those lines. Look, he might be back and he might be useful, but Edwards is the number one guy in what's going to be a very run-heavy offense. I don't think it's out of the question to suggest that you could rank Gus Edwards inside the top 30 if we knew for sure that he's going to be the clear number one running back. At the moment, it's kind of a lot of reports and like vague mutterings from coaching staff. I'd like to hear a little bit more, before I rank him high. But gosh, you could have a league winner, especially in a non-PPR or a half PPR league, if you get Edwards and he actually gets a near every down role. Because we are still going to see some checkdowns, and Edwards has improved as a pass catcher in the past. We know he's a good running back. He was a top 24 running back last year in Baltimore, and they didn't use him through the air at all. So I think we could realistically say that if Gus Edwards is the lead back, he's guaranteed to pay off in this spot. We just don't know for sure exactly how long that's going to last and if it's going to happen. Here's Jerome Ford, just after Nick Chubb. And that's because I don't really know which of them is going to have the value, and I think it's possible neither will, similar to that Steelers situation and the Titans situation. I think they're probably going to hurt each other. But there's certainly a situation where Nick Chubb just doesn't play or isn't good this year, and Jerome Ford's able to take over. They weren't really willing to give him the load. They brought in Kareem Hunt last year. They kept experimenting with Pierre Strong. That concerns me, but look at the finish. Running back 14. You're getting him very late in drafts. There's enough upside here. You're essentially taking a handcuff where the lead runner is already injured. That's kind of smart to me. So that's why he goes again ahead of all the other handcuffs, not because he has the most upside, but because he's by far the most likely to turn into a lead role without really having to do anything. Rico Dowdle is another who could just stumble into a lead role here because they brought in Ezekiel Elliott, who wasn't good 2 years ago, went to New England, and he was a good receiving back. He was a good blocking back, but he wasn't particularly good as a running back. And now he comes back to Dallas, where in his previous situation where he was with Tony Pollard was the guy to own. And now he's with Rico Dowdle, and everyone wants Ezekiel Elliott. That wasn't the case 2 years ago. Why do you want Ezekiel Elliott now? Rico Dowdle is the guy that you want. Now, to be fair, you might want neither of these guys. We've been talking about committee backs. In Dallas, that's traditionally been more valuable, but I'm not sure that it still is. Having said that, you're getting Dowdle way cheaper than you're getting a Jalen Warren or a Najee Harris or something like that. We're probably talking like 4 to 5 rounds later. I got him in the 4th round of a rookie draft the other day where you're allowed to draft undrafted veterans. Unowned veterans. Why would you not take a shot on Dowdle in the later rounds, especially if you've taken a 0 RB approach? You're getting him so cheap. I don't understand the risk. I will want a lot of Dowdle. It might not pay off, but it's worth the risk because this is the range where you take shots on guys with upside. And he's got the upside to be an every down back, or at least a most downs back with Zeke doing a lot of the blocking work. This is my favorite backup. And he's a pure backup. I don't think he's going to have a significant role that you can use. I think it's possible it's a committee where he's getting 30% of the touches, and that could provide some value on a bye week, depending on how it's going. But realistically, he's a backup. If Kyron Williams goes down, though, he's a league winner. And that's why I'm taking him here over a lot of these guys. In this range, you don't want a guy who is going to give you 30 to 40% of the touches and less than 10 PPR points each week, or around 10 PPR points each week. And that's just definitely going to happen because he's a receiving back. There is no upside there. That's just his role. That's not valuable to you in fantasy. You don't win your league with a 10-point PPR running back. You win your league with a guy who comes in after an injury and is an every down back and is getting you 25 points every single week. That's what Blake Corum can be. So you need to take Blake Corum if he's sitting around and your roster's full and you're willing to start taking those bench players. Corum should be the first guy off the list for me. Ezekiel Elliott kind of slides in here because I think realistically he could actually have a receiving role. He could be a blocking guy. And even though I think Dowdle's the main guy, it's not impossible that they just do something dumb and they make Zeke the guy for a while. I think there's enough upside there, especially if Dowdle gets injured. It's not impossible for them to just give Zeke the role. We saw that happen in New England. He was surprisingly valuable. So it's not impossible to see it happening here, but I don't know. I'm ranking him in this range, but if you've already got your roster full and you're looking for upside guys, Zeke is not a guy you take. Zeke is a guy you take if you're looking at people like Gus Edwards and Rico Dowdle. You're looking at guys who are going to offer a role and are more likely to offer a role, but the role they're going to give you is not going to be as good. So they're more likely to give you something, but the something is not as high as you could get from someone like a Blake Corum. That's where Zeke fits in. Chase Brown kind of sits a little bit on the other side of that. I do think he'll have more of a role than most of the backups, but I still see him as a probable backup. So he slides in here to me at number 40 because I don't think it's impossible that he wins the role over Zach Moss, and that would be valuable. I think it's likely that he has some committee role with Moss, where Moss might be getting 50 to 60% of the touches, and Chase Brown's getting maybe 40% of the touches or something like that. And I think he could certainly build on that. He's got the talent. He's only played for 1 year and he didn't get many opportunities behind Mixon. So I can certainly see a situation where he eventually takes over. And that upside's the reason I'm willing to take him, but his upside's not even close to Corum or a lot of the guys I'm about to talk about now. So we go to the lists now because I didn't want to make graphics for 60 players. That's crazy. I'm going to go through this a little bit quick fire. A lot of these guys are handcuffs, but there are a couple who aren't. I'm going to talk about them first. Jaleel McLaughlin could arguably be the Broncos starting back. I don't know who it's going to be. It could be Audric Esteem. And in that case, that's going to be a little bit concerning because you're still going to see a whole lot of McLaughlin as a change of pace back. And you're probably going to see P. Ryan as the receiving back. It could be Javonte Williams. And in that case, again, heap of Jaleel McLaughlin. Plus, you're still going to see some Audric Esteem, I suspect. Plus, you get P. Ryan as the receiving back. That's not good. If it's Jaleel McLaughlin, you don't have a change of pace back to work with because McLaughlin's the only guy with the lockdown role. He is the change of pace back. So if he becomes the every down guy and the change of pace back, then you really only have to worry about a receiving back, which would be P. Ryan or maybe Estime. We don't know. But I do think McLaughlin has a little bit more upside because of that. But gosh, it's ugly. The main reason I've got McLaughlin higher is because Cecil Lamey came out and said that McLaughlin should be higher. And he's very good. He's very accurate as a Broncos beat reporter. The other guys who aren't clear backups, I don't think J.K. Dobbins is really a backup. I think we just don't know who's the lead back there. I think it's probably Gus Edwards, but it could be Dobbins. Dobbins is technically the more talented back, but he's had a lot of injuries. So you're taking him on the chance that he gets the starting role. If he doesn't get the starting role, you just drop him immediately. You probably drop him before the start of the season, which is very different to what you're doing with most of these guys where you're waiting for an injury and then this back becomes very valuable. So for that reason, I've got Dobbins in this range, but he's a very different style of back than most of these other guys. The final guy that's not a true backup is Ty Chandler. I think that's a committee situation. And for that reason, I probably will have Chandler a little bit higher at times, depending on what the committee looks like in training camp. I do think that Chandler has plenty of upside if Aaron Jones goes down. And I think there's a good chance Aaron Jones goes down. My concern is that I don't know that Minnesota's necessarily going to be very good this year, which is why I'm not willing to have Chandler as high as some of those guys who could jump into a league winning role. I think that Chandler is probably going to be useful as a flex option or a bye week option. And then you're going to have situations where Aaron Jones goes down and suddenly becomes a good running back 2 kind of region. I think that's probably what you're looking at. Do you want to stash a guy on your bench because he could be a running back 2? Well, but arguably, if he's giving you something in the weeks before that happens, you might want that. So that's why he sits in that range. The true backups, Trey Benson, we talked about this. James Conner goes down, Benson slides straight in. He becomes quite valuable. And I do think he could have a bit of a role. And it's not impossible that he'll win the role on merit. Most of these guys would need an injury in front of him. I think Benson could actually win that starting role. Same thing applies with Jalen Wright. I do think that he's the backup for Raheem Mostert. Not so much for Devon Achane, but I do think that if Achane goes down, then Wright still works in conjunction with Mostert and some Jeff Wilson as well. So Wright kind of slides in as a guy who could take over that goal line role. He's a bit of a bigger back, especially compared to Achane. And I do think that he could play the Mostert role. But I think that right now he's probably the number 3 and he's not going to be very valuable. But there are multiple paths to him getting a role, and that's why I'm willing to put him a bit higher. Ray Davis, I think, could offer something. I think he could get some goal line carries. I think he could get some change of pace stuff. But, and it's a big but, if James Cook gets injured, I think that Ray Davis is a league winner potentially. I think we're talking about a top 12 back without doubt if we see an injury to James Cook. So for that reason, I want him on my bench. I'm just going to wait for that injury. And if it doesn't happen, that's okay. But watch my running back backup video if you want to know the chances of a running back getting injured in a given team. It's over 50%. So there is good chance that Cook will go down at some stage last year and this coming year, and you're going to see a lot of Ray Davis. He didn't last year. That's no indication of whether he will this year. Braylon Allen's in exactly the same situation, but he's probably going to get less touches until that happens. Breece Hall's the main guy, but if Breece Hall goes down, I believe that Braylon Allen will be an every down back, and he will play a Breece Hall-like role. He won't be as good as Breece Hall, but he'll be good. He's a big back. He's a good receiving back. I think that he's going to be really impressive. Tyler Algier, we've seen what happens when he gets involved. He's a solid back. He's able to rush it a high 4 into the 5 yards per carry in a good offense. And if Bijan Robinson goes down, suddenly he's an every down back. And that's the upside there. I don't think he's as good as a couple of these other guys in that range. And I do think potentially they're bringing in a veteran or a receiving back. Maybe they use a little bit more of Jace McClellan, the rookie. But I do think that Algier still has that upside as a handcuff. Zach Charbonnet is also a handcuff. I'm putting him in here as a handcuff. I know I talked about him playing like over 50% of snaps at times, but I don't think that they're actually snaps that are valuable. They're mostly receiving snaps where he's not getting past the ball. So that's not useful for fantasy. You want him out there when he's actually running the ball, and that wasn't happening last year. So you need a Kenneth Walker injury. You get that. Suddenly Charbonnet should become valuable, though we saw that wasn't always the case last year. And I talked about the Chiefs, and I talked about how Pacheco should be really valuable this year. What if he gets injured? They probably bring back Jerick McKinnon. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire becomes the every down back. And I think he's going to be very valuable in that role, and I still think he'll have a role even when Pacheco is healthy. I don't know exactly what that role is going to be, but he's going to be involved. And we saw that occurred. When he was out last season, that really helped Pacheco. So that clearly means that he's doing something. And I do think that they see him as the backup to Pacheco, and that when Pacheco is out, if it happens, and hopefully it won't, then Clyde Edwards-Helaire becomes valuable. I'll tear through his last 10 pretty quickly. Antonio Gibson, he's the backup in a bad offense, but he is a clear backup, and he's probably going to get some receiving work. So I'm willing to put him on my bench and take a shot on him. Marshawn Lloyd, backup to Josh Jacobs, but I don't really know that he's the full backup. I feel like AJ Dillon gets involved in Marshall if Jacobs goes down. So that kind of scares me off Lloyd a little bit. I think it caps his upside. Elijah Mitchell should be the upside for San Fran, but you just don't know. They brought in Garendo, who I think is probably a special teams guy. Jordan Mason will be involved. We saw that last year when there was no CMC. Mitchell played like 60% of snaps. Mason played 40% of snaps. It's hard to know what to make of that. I do think that maybe if we see an actual CMC injury where he goes down for the season, they just bring in someone else. But Mitchell has enough upside because if you get a couple of weeks with no CMC, Mitchell should have some value. Chuba Hubbard's a backup, but gosh, it's an ugly situation. The only reason I've got him this high is because I do think that Brooks could arguably miss the start of the season, and then suddenly you've got Hubbard, who's a starter briefly. Not a very good starter, but still better than no one. So in 0 RB, maybe Hubbard's a better option. Javonte Williams, well, I actually like Javonte Williams, but clearly the Broncos don't, and Sean McVay doesn't. And that's why he's this low. But there's still the possibility that that's just all smoke, and that actually Javonte Williams is still the guy. They keep saying he needs to earn the lead role, which is weird, but they certainly haven't said he's out. I know there's talk that he might be, but it's entirely possible he's still the lead back. So it's really hard to place him. I just don't want anything in that Broncos offense, really. I just think they're so limited upside. They're really going to struggle to run the ball. They're really going to struggle to score. So I don't want any of their players, and I feel like the safest one is McLaughlin, but I want none of them. Damian Pierce, technically the backup to Joe Mixon. Mixon goes down. I think you see Pierce, and then you see probably a good Bawale doing the receiving work. So that really limits Pierce's upside. Trey Sermon, I think, has more upside, but I think it's less accessible because you firstly need a Taylor injury, and then you need Sermon to definitely be the backup. There have been reports that he is the backup, but I'm just not convinced that that's the case. I do think we might see some Evan Hull moving in close to him in training camp, and I also think that Tyler Goodson would be involved even if Hull wasn't as well. So that's why I'm a little bit lower on Sermon, even though I really love the Colts backfield. Tyrone Tracy, more of a receiving back in a bad offense. I do think that potentially he could win the leading role from Devin Singletary. There's some upside there. But I also think that you possibly leave him on your bench waiting for a Singletary injury. Singletary gets injured, and all of a sudden Tracy's terrible. So I'm really torn on what to do with him. He's probably the kind of guy I draft, leave on my bench, and then drop a week out from the season when it becomes Singletary's definitely the clear number one. Audric Estime, I mean, it's the same in that whole Broncos situation. I don't want any of them, but he's one of the guys who could potentially win that every down role. And finally, Bucky Irving. I talked about him earlier. Bit of a smaller receiving back. Kind of does the same role as Rashad White. Don't really know what to expect from him. Is he the clear backup? If he's someone they're just going to use on special teams? Is he a receiving back? I don't know. I'm willing to take a shot on him if we're getting this low in drafts. Finally, you've watched the whole redraft rankings for running backs and hopefully for QBs as well. You've got a league draft coming up. You need help. Because I've told you how to rank those running backs compared to each other, but how do you rank them compared to other positions? Well, this is where I can help. You send me your league settings and I will list every player on all positions in order. Now, I know you can find that on the internet, but that's not for your league settings. That's just for random settings, and they're wrong. They're wrong for your league. You need settings specifically for your league if you're going to draft accurately and going to take advantage of opportunities. I've done this for many years in the past. We've had really good success. I would love to help you out in your league. You don't have to. $10 isn't going to move the dial for me. I'm just doing this for fun and to help people out, and it just kind of makes up for the time that it takes me to do, because it does take me over an hour to do them, but I'm happy to do it and help you out in your league. So make sure you hit me up. You can email me on benwasley23@gmail.com, or you can also hit me up on Instagram or Twitter as well. Speaking of Instagram and Twitter, please make sure you add us. We are at Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. It's got dynasty and rookie rankings up there at the moment, but we are going to put redraft rankings up there too. I'm just finishing off the wide receiver and tight end rankings. That'll be up within the next week. You can also, of course, look forward to our new website coming soon. It's currently being designed. I look forward to unveiling that soon. And make sure you head over to Razzball, football.razzball.com. I do articles there every single week and twice a week during the season. I'm talking about dynasty every single week. Just to release my sleepers article, that will be out probably the day after this video is released. So definitely look out for that. But every week I talk about something new with my dynasty rankings. I think it's really interesting. I hope you are enjoying them as well. That's all I've got for you for today. I'll be back in 3 days' time with another video. It will be on wide receivers. That's going to be a longie. So I hope you're ready for it. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.